No. The word came out of Whitmore Caldwell's mouth the way he said most things, like the matter had already been decided before anyone else had a chance to speak. And he stood at the head of the long mahogany table in the Caldwell Financial Group's 53rd floor conference room, his silver cufflinks catching the morning light off Lake Michigan, his expression carrying the particular boredom of a man who had been right about everything for 40 years and expected to keep going. Across from him, 6 of the most respected forensic accountants in Illinois shifted in their chairs. The stack of files in front of each of them was thick. The silence after Whitmore's word was thicker. "Been over this ledger for 3 days," said Arthur Reeves, the senior partner from Reeves and Morrow, adjusting his glasses. "The discrepancy is real. $11.4 million. We can't locate the source." Whitmore set down his coffee cup. "And look harder." That was when the door opened. She didn't knock. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not her age. Not the fact that she was carrying a worn canvas tote bag instead of a leather briefcase, and not that she was the only black woman in a room with 14 people in it. What they noticed first was that she didn't knock. She walked in the way someone walks into a room they've already solved. Her name was Adaeze Okonkwo, and she was 29 years old. Had been working as a contract analyst for the Illinois State Comptroller's Office for 4 years. Before that, she had spent 2 years at a nonprofit auditing municipal housing grants in the South Side, and before that, she had graduated summa cum laude from DePaul with a degree in accounting and a minor in mathematics that she'd mostly kept to herself because people tended to get strange when you mentioned it at parties. It was not, by anyone's definition in that room, supposed to be there. "Are you?" Whitmore asked. His voice was the kind of flat that wasn't really a question. "Adaeze Okonkwo," she said. "The comptroller's office sent me to assist the audit team." She set her tote bag on the credenza near the window and pulled out a single yellow legal pad. "I've been reviewing the preliminary filings since Tuesday." "Tuesday," Arthur Reeves repeated, glancing at Whitmore. "Tuesday," Adaeze confirmed, already looking at the spread of files on the table. Whitmore Caldwell leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his chest. He was the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to make a room feel smaller. "Mrs. Okonkwo," he said, "we have 6 firms in this room. Combined, that's over 200 years of financial forensics experience. What exactly do you think you're going to find that they haven't?" The 6 senior partners waited. Daisy looked up from the preliminary filings she'd begun sorting. She didn't smile, didn't look nervous. She looked, if anything, a little distracted, the way someone looks when they're listening to music in their head. "May I look at the original transfer authorizations?" she said. "Not the summaries, the originals." Whitmore's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. "Those are proprietary internal documents. I have a level 3 clearance from the comptroller." She pulled a laminated card from her tote bag and set it on the table with the same casualness someone might use to put down a grocery receipt. "I can show you the statute if you'd like." The room was quiet for a moment. Arthur Reeves looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at Adaeze. "Her what she asked for," he said finally, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man agreeing to something he was already certain would amount to nothing. What you need to understand about Whitmore Caldwell is that he built his empire the way some men build walls, brick by brick, each one chosen for how well it kept certain people out. Had grown up the son of a grain merchant in Decatur, had clawed his way through Northwestern on a partial scholarship and sheer will, and had spent 30 years turning a mid-sized regional fund into one of the most influential financial groups in the Midwest. He was not cruel in the way people sometimes imagine powerful men to be. It was something quieter and more corrosive. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that intelligence had a particular look, and that look was not Adaeze Okonkwo standing at his credenza with a yellow legal pad and a clearance badge. The transfer authorizations came up in a banker's box. Adeze sat down at the far end of the table, away from the senior partners, and began going through them page by page. Nobody paid her much attention. The 6 firms continued their own work. Whitmore took 3 phone calls in the next hour, all of them conducted quietly in the hallway, where he stood with his back very straight and his voice very controlled. An hour and 40 minutes in, Adeze looked up. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I think I need to show you something." He came back into the room without hurry, the way he did everything, and stood at the opposite end of the table looking down its length at her. "By all means," and she spread 3 pages side by side, as our transfer authorizations from March through May 2 years ago. Each one routes funds through a subsidiary called Caldwell Pacific Holdings. "That's a legitimate shell," Arthur Reeves said quickly. "Already cleared it." "For the transfers you can see, yes," Adeze said. "But these 3 are coded differently. Look at the authorization prefix." She pointed. 774. Every other authorization in this system uses a 6 prefix. A 774 is the internal code for the Caldwell Family Trust. The room changed, not loudly. These things never happen loudly in rooms like this. It was more like a barometric shift, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm. "What are you implying?" Whitmore's voice was still flat, but something had moved beneath it, the way a current moves beneath still water. "I'm not implying anything," Adeze said. "I'm saying that $11.4 million was routed through the Family Trust's authorization code over a period of 14 months. Which means either someone had access to that code who shouldn't have, or the transfers were personally authorized from within the trust." She paused. "Either way, it's not a discrepancy, it's a pattern." Silence. "That's a serious accusation," Arthur Reeves said. "It's a serious ledger," Adeze said. Whitmore walked the length of the table slowly. I stood beside her and looked down at the 3 pages. His hands were in his pockets. His face gave away nothing. Then he looked at her. "How old are you?" he asked. It landed the way he meant it to land, like a door closing. Adeze met his eyes. "Old enough to read an authorization code." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that might have been a cough. "Mrs. Okonkwo." Whitmore's voice dropped to something almost cordial. "I've been in this industry since before you were born. I have attorneys in 3 states and relationships in this city that go back decades. What you're describing is not a pattern. It's an incomplete understanding of a complex trust structure that you, with respect, do not have the background to interpret correctly." He picked up one of the 3 pages. "I'll have our general counsel walk you through it." "That would be fine," Adeze said. "You also ask them to explain the 14 transfers that were reversed within 48 hours of the audit announcement 2 weeks ago?" Whitmore set the page back down. Those don't show up in the summaries either," she said. "But they're in the raw transfer logs. I pulled them this morning." She set her legal pad on the table. On it, in handwriting that was small and precise, 14 entries: date, amount, authorization code, reversal date, all 14. One of the senior partners stood up from his chair slightly, trying to see. "May I?" Arthur Reeves started. "Of course," Adeze said, and she turned the legal pad so the room could see it. Whitmore Caldwell left the room after that. Not dramatically. He never did anything dramatically. It wasn't his style, but he left, and when he came back 15 minutes later, he had a different lawyer with him. A younger man in a charcoal suit who introduced himself as Brendan Holt from Caldwell's legal team, and who spent the next 20 minutes suggesting, in various indirect ways, that the 14 entries might reflect a data processing error. Adeze let him finish. Then she opened her tote bag and took out a single printed document. It was 42 pages long. She had been working on it since Tuesday. She set it in the center of the table. This is a full reconstruction of the transfer chain using the raw logs from the Caldwell Pacific server, cross-referenced with the Family Trust disbursement records from the State Fiduciary Registry. Had requested those records on Wednesday, which had required 3 phone calls. a formal written request, and one somewhat heated conversation with a clerk who'd initially told her the registry was offline for maintenance. The data processing error narrative doesn't hold. Reversals were manually initiated. They have individual user IDs attached to them. She didn't say whose user IDs. She didn't need to. Brendan Holt looked at the 42 pages and then looked at Whitmore and then looked at a spot on the wall that seemed very interesting to him. Suddenly, Whitmore stood very still. For the first time since she had walked into the room without knocking, he looked at her with something other than dismissal. It wasn't respect yet, wasn't even fully recognition. It was the look a man gets when the ground does something he didn't expect. Not collapse, not crack, just shift. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. The room waited. Adaeze thought of her father, Dr. Chukwemeka Okonkwo, who had been a professor of accounting at the University of Lagos before he came to the United States and spent 15 years teaching middle school math in Evanston because his credentials didn't transfer, and he was not the kind of man who complained about that. Just the kind of man who kept teaching. He thought of Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table when she was 11, 12, 13, working through problems he'd write out for her by hand. Not textbook problems, but real ones, the kind where the numbers didn't quite add up and you had to find out why. He used to say, "The numbers always tell the truth. People lie. Systems lie. The numbers just sit there and wait for someone to listen." She thought of all of that, said, "My father taught me." The Illinois State Comptroller's Office opened a formal investigation 17 days later. The 42-page reconstruction became the foundational document of the inquiry. Brendan Holt resigned from Caldwell's legal team in the third week. Arthur Reeves and Reeves and Morrow filed a disclosure with the State Bar, noting their own audit team's failure to identify the transfer pattern, which most people in the industry understood to be the legal equivalent of raising your hand before the teacher called on you. Whitmore Caldwell's attorneys negotiated for 4 months. In the end, the settlement required the full $11.4 million to be returned to the fund's investors, plus penalties, plus a supervised restructuring of the Caldwell Family Trust under independent oversight for a period of not less than 5 years. Whitmore never said publicly what he thought about Adaeze Okonkwo. He didn't give interviews after the settlement, retired to a house in Scottsdale, and, by most accounts, spent a great deal of time on the golf course, which is what men like Whitmore tend to do when the world stops accommodating them. Here is something that was reported in the Chicago Business Journal 6 weeks after the settlement closed, which means somebody told them and somebody knew. Whitmore Caldwell, one of his last acts before formally stepping down as chairman of Caldwell Financial Group, requested that the 42-page document prepared by Adaeze Okonkwo be placed in the company's permanent archive. Not destroyed, which is what his lawyers suggested. Not sealed. Placed in the archive with her name on it in the public-facing record. Nobody knows why. Maybe he was covering himself legally. Maybe, in the long arithmetic of a life, he had finally arrived at a number he couldn't argue with. Adaeze Okonkwo still works in public service. She turned down 2 offers from private firms in the year after the settlement. Both paid more than 3 times her comptroller's salary, and she turned them down the same way she walked into that conference room, without explanation and without apology. She is, as of now, the lead forensic analyst for a new state-level financial oversight initiative that her office launched 18 months ago. It's unglamorous work. It involves a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of unreturned emails and a lot of days when the numbers don't quite add up yet, and you have to sit with that and keep looking. Her father came to her office the week she was appointed, sat in the small chair across from her desk, and he looked at the framed DePaul diploma on the wall, and the 3 whiteboards covered in her handwriting, and the stack of yellow legal pads on the credenza. Didn't say much. He's not a man who says much. Just nodded, The way he used to nod on Sunday afternoons when she'd finally found the error in a problem he'd written for her. Not congratulations, exactly. More like recognition. Like, yes, that's it. That's what I meant. Are people in this world that the systems were not built for. People who were handed no particular door and so learned, quietly and without fanfare, to read the walls. Adaeze Okonkwo was not the first of them, and she will not be the last. But she was there, in that room on that morning, with her yellow legal pad and her clearance badge, and she did not knock. And the numbers told the truth, the way they always do, for anyone willing to listen long enough to hear them. If you know someone who was told they didn't belong in the room, leave their name in the comments. Let's make sure they're seen. I keep thinking about the yellow legal pad. Not the 42-page document. Not the settlement. Not the headlines in the Chicago Business Journal. Just that legal pad, the one a day set on the table and turned so the whole room could see it. 14 entries, handwritten, small and precise. Kind of writing you develop when you've spent years making sure every number is exactly where it belongs. I think about what it takes to walk into a room like that and not flinch. Not because you're fearless. I don't think Adaeze was fearless. I think she was just more committed to the truth than she was afraid of the reaction to it. That's a different thing. Fearlessness is an absence. What she had was a presence. Something she'd built, quietly, over years of Sunday afternoons at a kitchen table, with a father who believed that understanding was the most durable thing you could give a child. There's a version of this story where Whitmore Caldwell wins, where Adaeze walks in without her clearance badge, or without the raw transfer log she pulled at 6 in the morning, or without the 4 years of unglamorous work that taught her exactly what a 774 authorization prefix means. There's a version where she gets talked out of the room in the first 10 minutes by a man with silver cufflinks and 40 years of institutional weight behind him. That version happens every day to people who are just as capable and just as right, but who weren't given Sunday afternoons, who didn't have someone sit across from them and say, "The numbers always tell the truth." Listening. What I take from Adaeze's story isn't just that she was smart. Smart doesn't do it alone. What carried her through that room was something threefold, and I've thought about this long enough that I want to say it plainly. First, she had integrity. She didn't exaggerate what she found. She didn't perform outrage when Whitmore talked down to her. She just kept laying the documents on the table, one by one, and letting them speak. That kind of moral steadiness is rarer than skill. It's the thing that makes people trust what you say even when they don't want to believe it. Second, she had trained her mind. Not just studied, trained. The way her father trained her, not with textbooks alone, but with real problems, messy ones, the kind where the answer isn't in the back of the chapter. That's the difference between knowing information and knowing how to think. Whitmore had 200 years of combined experience in that room, and it still wasn't enough, because experience without deep understanding is just familiarity. Adaeze had understanding. And third, she showed up. She kept going when Brendan Holt started explaining things slowly, as if she needed the extra time. She kept going when Whitmore looked at her like she was a temporary inconvenience. She didn't leave the room and she didn't shrink in it. That kind of persistence, the ordinary, unglamorous kind that doesn't look like courage from the outside, is the thing that turns ability into outcome. Those three things together. The integrity to be honest, the mind she'd built over years, the will to stay in the room. Take anyone away, and the story ends differently. What Whitmore Caldwell put in that archive wasn't just a document. It was an acknowledgement that some things cannot be argued with, no matter how long you've been in the business, no matter how many lawyers you keep on retainer. A truth has a way of sitting there, patient and exact, until someone finally stops talking long enough to read it. Her father taught her that, and she walked into that room and proved it.